Thank you very much, Chief Day. I too would like to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned in your own remarks. Over time, people may forget, but I don't think they will, the residential schools. But we must take advantage of the residential school survivors who are alive today. There's no doubt that one of the most emotional events of my life was being a witness at one of the sessions, the session in Montreal, and listening to the survivors. And I just simply want to pick up on your mention of Margaret Wabineau, who was Canada's oldest living survivor until she passed away. I also, Chief Day, want to pick up on something else that you said. When you stood up in front of the audience, and your very first remarks were of the refugees and of the need to talk to the elders. And you know, I think that that's something that Canadians should hear from coast to coast to coast. The fact is that here at a seminar on education, at a seminar on First Nations education, that the regional chief from Ontario stood up and reminded us all as Canadians and of members of the First Nations of our responsibilities to the world, that this country has come of age. Grant, when you spoke the way that you did. And I really want to congratulate you on bringing all Canadians to the realization that we have a responsibility to each other and we have a responsibility to the world. So thank you very, very much, Chief. I have two embarrassing things that have occurred to me here. One of them is that I'm going to speak to you about two subjects. One of them I've been asked to speak to you about is MAI, the education initiative that I started, and that Carlana Lindman, who is hiding there in Liberal Red, is very much in charge of, and very much the boss of it. She's from Thunder Bay. But the other thing that is, this one is a little more embarrassing. I have, in my life, before danced the hokey pokey, but I have never been asked to stick my bum out in front of 200 people. And I really am very worried about the cameras that are here. Anyway, but thank God my political career is over. Let me just simply, I would like to talk about two things. The other embarrassing thing that has happened is I've been asked to speak about the new minister of Aboriginal Affairs. And nobody told me that she was going to be here. But she is, and so I'm still going to speak about her. But let me just begin by talking very briefly about three of MAEI's programs, just in case some of you may not be too aware. I want to pick up a certain aspect of our youth entrepreneurship program. And I want to do it because one of the things that happens, not when I'm speaking in front of an audience such as this, but when you're speaking in front of an audience sometimes of educators where there are no First Nations members, or you're speaking to educators who are not fully aware. And they will talk about why is culture so important? Why are languages so important? And I'm sure you've had the same discussions yourself when people have asked you, why is culture such an important part of it? And one of the things that we discovered when we set up our business program, which has been a huge success. We started out with 3 schools, we're now in 47 schools. But the reason that course has taken off, it started here at the school in Thunder Bay, the reserve school in Thunder Bay, Cromarty. But very quickly, after we got to about 3 schools, something happened. A young boy, a young Cree here in Thunder Bay came up to me and he said, "Mr. Martin, I don't quite understand something. This course is for us, but all of your examples are from Toronto, they're from Vancouver, they're from Montreal, and some of them are from New York. But the fact is that this is supposed to be a business course for young Indigenous Canadians, and there are no Indigenous examples. None of them are occurring on reserve, none of them are occurring in Northern Ontario or elsewhere." And so the bell suddenly went off, and we brought in 2 of our teachers, both Indigenous, and we brought in a publishing company, and for a year they set aside and we designed the first set of workbooks and textbooks teaching business ever in an Aboriginal, in an Indigenous context. And as a result of that, the course took off, and that's why we're in 47 schools. And I've been to those schools, and Carlana has been to them many times, and when you sit down and you talk to these students, What really grabs them is that they're able to talk about it within the context of their own culture, within the context of their own history. The First Nations were huge traders from North to South America. And when you're able to talk about it in a way that is relative to their culture, it's enormously important. And you know, people will say, well, you can't teach it. You can't talk about culture and other things except when you're talking about culture, but you can. You can bring the First Nations culture into every single area that you want to study. And I think it's very important that Canadians understand that, and it's why I wanted to mention it to you today. The second thing I want to talk to you about is the principles course. Now, Carlana Lindman, along with 13 expert Aboriginal educators in the University of Toronto, have designed a course for principals, not courses for principals who are going to be principals in downtown Toronto, but principals who are going to be in reserve schools up through the north, right across the country. Principals who've got to deal with a very different set of problems without the benefit of a Ministry of Education in Ontario, without the benefit of all that the large school boards in Montreal or Vancouver have. And the course is being a tremendous success. We spent a year and a half developing the modules, and now we're in the middle of a pilot project. There are 20 principals from across Canada, 5 from Ontario, who are taking the course online. And it looks like it's going to be a tremendous success. And one of the things that we would like to talk to you about at some time is where do we go from here with this course? Is there a second stage? Are there other areas that we should look at? And so what I would really say to you, Chief Peters, as the education chief, to you, Chief Day, is that this is the kind of area in which I think we should work together. And we are very, very open to doing this. And then the last that I would mention to you is our literacy course. Some of you heard the results of our literacy course at Kettle and Stony Point and at Walpole Island. But the fact is that it was a course that went in with a literacy rate was 15% compared to the Ontario standard. And 4 years later, after when the course had completed its term, it was evaluated by the University of Toronto. The fact is that 70% of the kids in grade 3 were at the Ontario standard. That's the Ontario average. And the greatest thing is that those who could read, those who could write were above the Ontario standard. And the thing that gave me the greatest deal of pride is that the girls in those two schools could read better than the girls in Ontario could right across. And so it was a tremendous, tremendous success. But what it says is something else, and I'm now looking at the minister. It was expensive as heck to do the pilot program, Minister. It's the kind of thing that we're going to publish. We're going to start it in other schools. But sooner or later, Minister, as fundamental revolutions take place within the First Nations education system, the Canadian government is going to have to play its role. And I can't tell you, having been the Minister of Finance and having Carolyn Bennett, when she was another minister, come to me for money, what a pleasure it's going to be to go for you for money. Could I have a glass of water? Could you get me one? Now, let me go to the second thing that I was asked to do, was to speak about the current government and the minister. I did not know Carolyn Bennett was going to be here this morning. I didn't know that I was going to stand up in front of the boss and do this. Thank you very much. And I won't take immeasurable amount of time on it, but I just want to say that I served in cabinet with Carolyn Bennett when she was the Minister of Public Health. I knew Carolyn Bennett long before she became a minister. Her interest in education, her interest in First Nations education, the interest that brought her here today did not start yesterday. This has been her interest from the beginning of time. And she's incredibly knowledgeable, but she is also incredibly sincere in what she wants to do. And I must say that I do believe that this is a magic period. Chief Peters and Chief Day spoke about it. The fact is that the relationship with the province of Ontario and the First Nations could never have been better. We all know what happened in the last 10 years. I don't want to be partisan. Well, yes, I do want to be partisan, but I'm not going to be. The fact of the matter is that relationship with Ontario was one that you were building on. And let me tell you, I know Carolyn Bennett, and I know Justin Trudeau, and I know this government. And that also is one that you will be able to work on. But let me say as well that they will need something from you. There is no Department of Education in Carolyn Bennett's ministry. There is no Department of Education in Ottawa. That's why it was so absurd that the previous government decided that what they were going to do is impose upon you, look at the educators, look at the Indigenous educators in this country, look at the people who are in this room. And a Department of Aboriginal Affairs that has no educators at all attempted to impose upon you their own will and basically told you that if you didn't accept it, it was that way or the highway, is simply a triumph of stupidity. And not what we want to do now. What we want to do is we want to reverse that. Carolyn wants to reverse it. And I know I have talked to Justin Trudeau and what he said during the election campaign and what he has said since. What he said in Carolyn's mandate letter is as sincere as it can possibly be. That they want to work with you. They want to make this happen. But that Carolyn also was going to require, she may not want to say this to you, but she's going to need something from you. She is going to need for you, the education leaders of the First Nations, to set out your own plan for successful education in a strong and united voice. A plan that will show how you will run the system. A plan that stresses the importance of languages and cultures, as both chiefs said, but a plan that will also be at the top end of mathematics, of science, history, literature, and all of those others. Fundamentally, what she will need from you is a plan that will show what kind of a system that you can have and you will build if you have real and consistent funding. And that is what is all important here. This is a combination of working together. The promise has been there for the funding. And I think that some of you will say you don't think that's enough. And you know something, I'll agree with you. The fact of the matter is that education is an ever-evolving thing. And the problems that you face in terms of education are not simply limited to the classroom, but they are limited to the fact the number of children who've been taken away from the reserves on welfare. They are related to a welfare program that isn't working, that you're going to have to change. And when that happens, you're going to have children in care in the schools, and you're going to have teachers who understand how to work with those children in care. And that's going to cost money. And so it's a question of working together. And that's why it's so important that Dr. Bennett is here. That's why it's so important that we're having this discussion. And then I'm going to close on one other thing. I don't want to take too much of your time. But the reason that the country, not simply the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, requires from you, Indigenous Affairs, that the Minister requires from you is a plan, is something else. I'm going to quote, take my glasses off, I'm going to quote from something that Chief Peters said. He talked recently, I don't know where you were, Chief Peters, when you said this, but I'm quoting from you. We are in the midst of a changing social and political environment where First Nations are not alone in the fight, but are joined by other Canadians to voice our common interests. I could not have said this better. What I believe that the Chief was saying to you, saying whoever the audience was when he said that, is that the world is changing fundamentally. Education is changing fundamentally. As Chief Day said, the world is changing in some ways that are not all that pleasant, and we're going to have to face up to them and the kinds of things that you talked about. But if you listen to what Chief Peters said, what he is saying is, we want to have this fight for better education. We want to have this fight for decent revenue sharing and for an understanding of natural resources. We don't want this to be a fight between the First Nations and other Canadians. We want this to be a fight where Canadians stand hand in hand, as we did around this room, basically dealing with the issues that we have to face. And for that to happen, your plan is going to have to be the one that, in fact, Canadians speak to. And I can tell you something. Yesterday, I was in Halifax with the Mi'kmaq, and the number of university presidents were there. If we do this, if you develop the plan and Carolyn basically implements it, you will have every single university in this country supporting you. The deans of education in every single faculty in this country came out with an accord 5 years ago. And they did this in the face of the government that was in office at the time, talking about the necessity to work together in terms of First Nations education. The Teachers Federation of Canada has come out in favor of what you want to do. The school boards across Canada, the Canadian school boards, have come out in favor of what you want to do. And I have spoken to most ministries of education in this country, and they will support you. Shortly, what can happen if you come up with a plan, if you are strong and united behind the kind of plan that you want, and you get Carolyn Bennett and the federal government behind you, and they will be there, then what we will do is bring the entire education constituency in this country behind the First Nations. And then just think of what that will mean. If you go to the Canadian people, it won't be you just saying this is the First Nations plan, but will be every single educator in the land saying that this is the First Nations plan and it makes sense. Who in God's name is going to be able to withstand that? Who is going to say that's wrong? Who's going to say that they're not being accountable? No one can. And that, I believe, is feasible, and I believe that it has to happen. And I believe it's going to happen because of meetings like this. Thank you very much.